It's time for another episode of Gospel Preaching Live, brought to you by the Kearney Church of Christ, which meets at 406 North Clark in Kearney, Missouri. Make plans to come out and visit the brethren, who look forward to seeing you. And now the host of Gospel Preaching Live, Richard Dodson.
Welcome to Gospel Preaching Live. My name is Richard Dodson. I am the minister of the Kearney Church of Christ. Every Sunday evening at 6 p.m. and Thursday evenings at 7 p.m., I try to come to you live, bringing you a message from God's Word. And I pray it's beneficial, that you're built up by that, and you're able to share it with other people. So if you're watching on Facebook and YouTube, give me a like if you would, and share it with as many people as you could. I'd sure appreciate that. Now, if you are watching or listening outside of Facebook and YouTube, and you want to contact me, I guess you could contact me if you were on Facebook or YouTube the same way. But you can call or text 816-686-9517. That's 816-686-9517. And keep in mind, I'm in the Central Time Zone. And you can also email me at gospelpreachinglive@gmail.com. That's gospelpreachinglive@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. Can't promise to be able to fulfill your requests, but I will do my best. I really will. Okay, this evening's lesson has to do with influence. And the question is, can I be influenced? You know, there's been a lot of things in the news lately regarding influence and things that have been on the media, such as the things that Disney has been doing with some of their shows to promote an agenda. And of course, that's old news. I mean, there's been things that have been tried like that for many years. The earliest that I can remember was that there used to be subliminal messages in elevator music. For instance, when you went into a shopping store, some department store, there would be music in the background, and the subliminal music would be telling you, do not steal. So things were trying to influence you at that time. Now, in the Bible, we read about people, there's many examples, and we'll look at a few tonight. But just off the top of my head, I can't help but forget about Lot. You know, he was the nephew of Abraham, and he had left with Abraham when God told Abraham to leave his father's country and go to one that I'll show you. He went with him. And as they grew, their herds grew, and there was strife among their herdsmen. And Abraham said, hey, look, you know, you go one way, I'll go the other, and that'll end the strife. And so Lot looked down toward Sodom and the well-watered plains, and he thought that'd be a good place for his herds. And so he said he'd go that way. And it's funny because he pitched his tent in Sodom, but he ended up living, as we read about in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, he was living in Sodom at that time. So he was influenced, even though the Bible said he was a righteous man. You know, he was influenced to move toward that city. Rehoboam, I think of Rehoboam, Solomon's son. You know, he was faced with a delicate situation, and he went to Solomon's older, wiser guides, people who that he trusted for influence. Solomon did. And he heard their response, but then he went back to his friends that he grew up with, and he asked them about the same situation, and they gave him opposite advice other than what the Solomon's people had, and he decided to go along with his younger crowd, and of course that cost him dearly. He paid for that. So influence is an important part of the Bible, because there's many people that we can read about who were influenced, good or bad. And like I said, we'll look at a few tonight, but influence is something that we have to be mindful of as Christians, because that's something, as we're going to see, that's something we have to manage. We're going to be influenced, and we're going to influence other people, but we're going to have to manage that influence. Now, when we're talking about influence, A definition of influence, just for us all to start off on the same note, it's the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself. So it's influencing. In our case, it's influencing someone for good or for bad. There's a story that John Mundy, he preaches at the Steel Church of Christ down in Steel, Missouri. I was listening to his devotional Thursday, and he gave a story, and it really fits this lesson. And I'd like to tell you this story now, but I wanted to give John the credit because I didn't hear this other than through John. But John doesn't care as long as it's being used to edify God. He doesn't care. But needless to say, there was two young men, and I think they grew up in Montana, Wyoming. Never saw the ocean. Were never around any water, or were never around any boats. They were landlubbers. But yet, when they grew up, they both became captains of their own ships out on the ocean. And people were perplexed out how this happened. And the only thing that people could come up with was there was a picture like this hanging over their dining room table. And so for every meal that they sat, they always looked at that picture. And so they figured that picture is what influenced them to want to become sea captains. And I think it's a good story. And it does illustrate the power of influence, just putting an idea in someone's heads. Now, we have, as I already mentioned, a few, but let's go ahead and look at some biblical examples of people who were influenced in the Bible. We'll talk about King Solomon, for instance. He was, by all those wives that he had, they influenced him. The nation of Israel was influenced. A converted husband that's made reference to in 1 Peter 3. Not a specific one, but one that could possibly happen. And then Christians, specifically, I think he's talking about preachers, but who were influenced in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 12 through 14. So let's go ahead and look at King Solomon. Let me make that bigger for you so you can read. We're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 1 through 4. Notice what's said about King Solomon. It says, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, if I'm saying these right, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, who were princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. Now, it's interesting. This is a point that just hit me. It says Solomon clung to these in love, and I don't know how many times I've heard people talk about someone that they were in love with, and the concern was that this person might not be good for them, that maybe they need to fall out of love with them because they might have a negative influence. And I've heard songs. Barbara Mandrell's song, for instance, she's got a line from one of her songs that says, if loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right. Well, in this case with Solomon, he's going to find out that, yes, he wish he was right, because loving these women were wrong, and they led him astray. They influenced him to turn his heart from God. And, that's not good. And that's not the way we want to be influenced. But there's lessons there. I guess really I could build a lesson just right there about being careful about choosing your mate, because there's a lot to be said about who you marry. I've always said it's a smarter thing to find a fellow Christian to marry. I wouldn't say it's a sin to marry a non-Christian, but it sure is smarter. But even with that, there's no guarantees. People do fall away. But you have to be careful, because if anyone's going to influence someone, it's going to be your mate, as this what happened to Solomon. So you got to be very careful. Like I said, This sermon is a warning about managing your influences and how you're influenced and how you influence other people. And so this is a good example to go to. How about 1 Samuel chapter 8? The nation of Israel. Notice they were led by God. God was their king. Boy, can you imagine if God was running for president of the United States? Now, he probably wouldn't get elected, sadly, but I'd vote for him. And I'd hope the country would. I really do. I do hope the country would. But Israel had that. They had the best ruler. They had God. You can't get any better than that. But they were influenced by the nations around them. Let's read chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, verse 4 through 7. It says, Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. You see, they were being influenced by all the countries around them. They wanted to be like them. And goes on to say this thing displeased Samuel. And of course, he went ahead and prayed to God about it. And what did God do? He said, do what they say and appoint for them a king. He said, they not rejected you. They have rejected me from being king over them. And again, that's influence. You're going to lose the best ruler for a ruler for a far inferior one, and they paid a price for that, as we know through history. They had some wicked rulers. I mean, it's sad. They had the best one. How about a converted husband? We talked about, and like I said, this one may not be converted. It paints a scenario where one would be in 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2. But then notice what he says. He said, Likewise, wives, Peter did, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Now, he's talking about influence. He's talking about a husband being converted by his Christian wife who doesn't even preach a word to them. They just see the gospel in action in their life. My mom, and I've said this over and over again, my mother always said, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one. And it's so important. And we'll look at some more passages that teach this. It is so important for non-believers to see Christ in our lives. But this goes to show you that there can be a tremendous amount of influence by a believing wife on her non-believing husband. And I would say likewise, it would go the other way as well. A believing husband who has a non-believing wife could influence her to be converted. But needless to say, it shows the power of influence. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 12 through 14, when Paul was imprisoned, and notice what he said about other Christians preaching the gospel. He goes, this is chapter 1, verse 12 through 14 of Philippians. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. You see, the persecution that the Apostle Paul was going through, being imprisoned, somehow influenced others to be more bold to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's a good thing. And I'm just using this as an example of how influence is a strong thing and how the Bible talks about influence, and the Lord uses, especially our good works, to influence others for good. Now, there is biblical teaching on influence I'd like to address. There was some teaching on influence to the Corinthian church. There's those who follow Jesus, and when Jesus was giving his Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, those who were first learning from Jesus, who were gathered to hear him speak. And then, of course, the church itself can have influence, as we're going to read about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, but let's first look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And in that chapter, there was a man who had his father's wife, and Paul was disappointed. Obviously, that's wrong. We understand that to be wrong, but why the church wasn't doing something about that is a mystery, and that's what Paul was having trouble with, because they weren't doing what they should. They should have withdrew from him, but they were boasting about this. And so what does he say? He goes, "Your boasting's not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump?" And so what he's teaching is, if you don't take care of this man and his sinful conduct and get him out of the church, that sin, or sin itself, can spread. Others can become infected by themselves being tempted and falling into sin. And the comparison he uses is how a little leaven, if you ever seen people, I've never made bread. I tried one time. It was a disaster. I'm not a baker. But I do know I've watched my wife make bread, and she just puts a little yeast in the dough, not much, just a little yeast, and kneads that dough up, and then she lets it sit. In fact, she brings it in here with a heater, because a lot of times I can't get in my office. It's a smaller room. So she brings it in here and turns on the heater and lets the dough rise. It keeps me out of there. But of course, I'm getting paid off with fresh bread, so I can put up with that. But needless to say, that's the comparison he's making, is what that little yeast can do to a lump of dough, and then what might that man who had his father's wife do to the whole church there in Corinth. Yeah, sin can be infectious. I mean, sin can hurt. And look at all we did around the world. Churches around the world took different steps, but we took steps to try to keep from being infected by the coronavirus. And are we as concerned about sin? Because that's more contagious. We got to be careful about that, and that's what he's trying to get across. In chapter 15 of verse 33, now he starts addressing our companions. He says, "Bad company ruins good morals." We got to be careful about the people we hang around, because they can influence us for bad, and so that's all we know that. We've heard that from our youth. We have to be careful about our companions. All right, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14 through 16. This is where Jesus was talking about our influence as Christians. He said, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all that's in the house." He said, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." And that's the same thing that Peter says in 1 Peter 2 and verse 12. These people who are not believers can see your good works, and you can be a positive influence for the Lord's cause. You can bring them to Christ by you living a godly life, just like the woman we talked about in 1 Peter 3. So that's something that we need to think about. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, he tells the Thessalonian church there, Paul did in verse 6 and 7, he says, "You become imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit, so that you," being that church there in the Thessalonian church, "you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia." And with that example, they're having influence. They're influencing other people for good. So that's just some things that the Bible teaches about influence that I think we need to know. Now, some things I want to bring up, and this has to do with having bad companions that we've already addressed. But it's very easy how we can be influenced for bad. And this is what we have to manage. Because in most churches you gather that I know of, you meet on Sunday morning for a couple hours, Sunday evening, if you're lucky. A lot of churches are doing away with that. And that's an hour. And then you got a Wednesday night Bible study for an hour. So you're around brethren for 4 hours a week, if you're lucky. But yet we spend more than 4 hours a day probably with TV shows or movies, books, music, and worldly friends. And we're talking about being around Christians 4 hours a week, and we're being influenced for bad many times longer than that. And we're not managing our influence very well because these things do influence us. There's a lot of bad things on TV shows and movies. I don't even know if they make G-rated movies anymore. But you got Facebook and YouTube. I was telling my wife on my Facebook, I said, I'm about ready to get off of it because you just can't go down the what they call the wall. I'm not really good on these things, but I call it porn. I see dirty pictures that pop up, women wearing scantily clothes and doing things. I mean, you just have to fly through it, but it's bad, and you can be influenced by these things. The same with music. Uh, every once in a while, I'll hear a tune that I don't normally listen to, and I'll like it. And one of my kids will say, "Hey, have you heard the words of this song?" And I'll have to look up the words, and I'll just be like, "Wow, I can't believe I was singing to that song. This is filthy." That can influence someone for bad. Books can influence you for bad. Well, and of course, the worldly friends. You need to be careful about your companions. But let's talk about what Jesus said in John 17, because you're probably sitting there thinking, well, since we spend so much time in the world, how can we protect ourselves? Well, see, here's the deal. Jesus prayed in John 17 and verse 14 through 19 that he did not want us to be taken out of the world. This was the prayer he gave the night he was betrayed. He says, he praying to God, I have given them, his disciples, your word. And the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. And then he said this, I do not ask that you take them out of the world. So we're going to have to live here. And he says, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake, I consecrate myself that they also may be sanctified in truth. Okay, we're going to have to be here. That's what Jesus wants. He wants us in the world, and the world has a lot of evil influences. So we're going to have to manage these influences because we want to be influencing others for good instead of others influencing us for bad. Now, how can we do that? Well, we need to be very careful about coming to church. And we're going to look at these 4 points: coming to church, singing, Bible study, and prayer. And I only picked a few things. There's more that we can talk about that we can do to be influenced for good. But coming to church in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25, that's a big one. Notice what's said. He said, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. That's influence. That's what he's saying. How are we going to influence each other to love and good works? That's what we want to do. And he says, by not neglecting to meet together as the habit of some. And then he goes on to say, encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. But yeah, we got to go to church because we're going to be influenced for good. If that's the Lord's church, that's a good thing. And you need to be there. That's like getting a breath of cold ice water on a hot day after you've been working outside. It's refreshing. You're being around like-minded people who are going to build you up. And you need that. I need that. And I need to see you at church. And you need to see me at church. Because we're going to be both going there, not just to worship God, but to influence each other to love and good work. So that's a good point. How about singing? A lot of times people don't sing as much as they used to. People would go to people's houses when I was younger just for singing. And Colossians 3:16 says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. This admonishing, teaching and admonishing is a building up. It's a way of encouraging, urging you to do what's right. And songs that we sing at church, they do that very thing. They can urge you and encourage you to do that. And we see that in the Bible with Christians singing. And you don't have to just be at church to do that. You know, you can be alone and do that. Let other people hear you singing these songs. If you're outside working in the yard, sing a gospel song. You know, whatever you may be doing, sing. Let your family hear you sing. And then maybe they'll join you in singing. But singing is something that can influence others, and we need to be thankful for that and take more advantage of it. Bible study is so important. Proverbs 15:31, the ear that listens to life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. In other words, if you're listening to God's word, you're going to be influenced for good. Nothing bad is going to happen in Bible study, okay? Only good. And so you need to be listening to the Bible. Remember, faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. And of course, Romans, that same chapter talks about how are they going to hear without a preacher? Well, you know, you don't need a guy like me to just bring you the word. You got all kinds of preachers in the Bible that are preaching lessons that you can listen to. And you can listen to that, and that's going to help you dwell among the wise. That's going to influence you for good. That's exactly what he's saying. And then prayer. Oh, prayer is so important. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 41. When Jesus was in the garden, what did he tell his disciples? Watch and pray. Why? That you may not enter into temptation. Watch and pray that you may not. See, we need to be praying, because praying to God can influence us to do good, not bad. You know, we're talking to God, and that's a good thing. So we need to be busy doing that very thing. Okay, can you be influenced? The answer is yes. Yes, and you can influence others as well. Will you be influenced? Absolutely, you're going to be influenced, and you're going to influence others, whether you want to or not. So you need to make a choice. You need to choose to be influenced for good, and you need to choose to influence others for good. And that's going to happen when you properly manage these influences. You can't leave the world. You're going to get bombarded with bad influences, but you need to manage them. So be careful, about the things you see on the internet. Be careful about the music you listen to, and be careful about how much you're taking in. Compare it to how much your brethren and the Lord is influencing you, especially the Lord through his word. Let's keep these things in mind, and perhaps we're going to be influenced then for good, and we'll be able to manage our influenced behavior a lot better. Okay, that's all I have for you this evening. If you're ever in the Kearney, Missouri area, hey, would you come visit us at 406 North Clark? We meet every Sunday morning at 9:30 for Bible study, 10:30 for worship. We'd love to have you. And you can learn all about the church, but even a map, if you need a map to get there, our phone number, contact information, go to kearneychurch.com, and there you can learn everything you need to know. If you like this lesson, you can hear others like this by tuning in to KPGZ 102.7 FM every Sunday morning at 7 a.m., and you'll hear me preach a gospel lesson. Now, if you live outside of Kearney and you cannot pick up the signal, that's not a problem. You can stream it on your mobile device. They do that. Berean Spirits is an internet show I'm on with some other preachers, where we get together every Thursday morning at 10 o'clock and we study an issue. And we invite other people to join us on Facebook and YouTube by making comments. How can you take part? By going to kearneychurch.com and pressing on the Facebook, YouTube, or Berean Spirits link. Now, if you can't join us every Thursday at 10 a.m., you can still watch past episodes, and I'd invite you to do that. Okay, that's all I have for you. Hopefully it's been beneficial for you. Now, Lord willing, I'll come to you again this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Until then, remember, this is the day the Lord has made. Let's rejoice in it and be glad.
This has been Gospel Preaching Live. Join us each week as truth is taught, faith is examined, and beliefs are challenged. Be sure and hit the like button so you can be notified of future episodes. And to watch past episodes, go to our website, kearneychurch.com. This has been a work of the Kearney Church of Christ.